The wind came off the downs that night, carrying the smell of wet wool and coal smoke, and under it, fainter, the sweeter rot of old hay. It was the last week of January, and the yard behind the Kestrel Inn was black ice from the trough to the stable door. A single lantern hung inside the stable on a nail that had worked loose since Michaelmas, and nobody had troubled to drive it back in, because nobody troubled about much at the Kestrel that did not put coin directly into a till. Agnes Thorne was the kind of woman an inn forgot the moment she left the room, not the innkeeper's daughter, not kin to anyone who mattered. She swept, she mended harness, she calmed horses that had put 3 grooms on their backs before her, and she slept in the loft above the tack room because it was warmer there than the room she'd have paid for otherwise, and because no one begrudged a hired girl a corner of straw. She was 23, fatherless 4 winters now, and her father had been a farrier, and the only thing he had left her that anyone could see was a gift for quieting a frightened animal with nothing but a flat hand and a low voice. That lantern was going to bring the whole stable down before the week was out. Agnes had said so twice to Mr. Dill, who ran the inn, and twice he had told her the nail would hold, and she had gone back to work because a hired girl does not tell a man his own stable a 3rd time. Before the story goes further, if tales like hers are the kind that keep you company on a quiet evening, subscribe to the channel now, and let's go back to that cold yard together. That evening a traveller had come in on a tired bay gelding, asking for a room and saying little else. He gave his name as Mr. Fell, paid in advance, and ate his supper alone by the fire, with his coat still buttoned, as though he did not intend to stay comfortable long enough to need it off. He was not a handsome man. His nose had been broken once and set a little wrong, and his eyes were the brown of strong tea gone cold, tired at the corners in the way of men who slept badly and did not say why. He asked Mrs. Dill, in passing, how business went, and whether the roof held in weather, and how the girl in the stable came to be so good with horses. Mrs. Dill said Agnes Thorne could do things with a colicking mare that the farrier himself couldn't, and that the girl asked for nothing beyond her keep, which Mrs. Dill thought was either very good or very foolish of her. She hadn't decided which. Mr. Fell said nothing to that. He finished his supper and went out to check on his own horse, he said, though the ostler had already seen to it twice. It happened a little after 9. Tam, the stable boy, was asleep in the loft above the last stall, curled in the straw the way he always was, because Tam had no people either, and the loft was the only bed anyone had ever given him without asking for something back. The wind found the loose nail. The lantern swung once, twice, and came down into a heap of dry straw, not 2 feet from where Tam lay. Agnes was crossing the yard with a bucket when she saw the light drop wrong. She did not think. She moved. She was through the stable door before the straw had properly caught, and she had her cloak off her shoulders and over the small climbing flame before it found its second breath. She beat it down with her bare hands, because there was no time to find water, and the wool of her cloak took the burn instead of the boy. She dragged Tam down the loft ladder by the arm before he was fully woken, and she turned 2 frightened horses loose from their stalls with the flat of her hand and a voice pitched low. Because a horse that smells smoke and cannot run will do worse than any fire, and a horse that can run will save itself. By the time Mr. Dill came out with a lantern of his own, it was over. The straw was black in one corner and smoking, not burning. The horses stood shivering by the trough. Tam sat against the wall, with his hands wrapped in Agnes's ruined cloak, crying the way boys of 11 cry when they are trying very hard not to. And Agnes knelt in front of him, checking his fingers for burns, before anyone had thought to ask if she had any of her own. She had. Her palms were red and blistered, where the wool had not been enough. She did not show them to anyone. She put her hands behind her back when Mrs. Dill came running, and she said it was nothing, and she said Tam was the one who wanted looking at, and she said all this so plainly and so quickly that no one thought to press her. What no one in that yard knew, and what Agnes herself did not learn until much later, was that a man standing in the black mouth of the stable door, unremarked, had watched every part of it. He had not called out, he had not stepped forward to help, though his instinct had been to, until he understood that his help was not wanted and was not needed, and that what he was watching was a thing that would stop being true the moment anyone knew it was being watched. He stood very still in the cold, and observed a woman who believed herself entirely alone do the costliest thing available to her, for a boy who could never repay her, and ask nothing after. She did not know then that the man in the doorway was not Mr. Fell of no particular county, but Gareth Alastair Rivenhall, 9th Duke of that name, who travelled his own lands from time to time under a name that was half his own, so that he might learn what his tenants and his stewards and his innkeepers did, when they believed no duke was near enough to matter. She did not know that he had come to the kestrel that week for exactly that reason, because a letter had reached him complaining that the roof leaked and the accounts did not add, and that he meant to see for himself before he judged anyone. She did not know that what he saw that night would matter to her more than anything a duke's coin could buy her. She only knew her hands hurt, and that the boy was safe, and that this, to her, was the whole of the matter. Mrs. Dill wanted to send for the surgeon at once and put it on the house's account. Agnes said no need, salve and a clean rag would do, and she said it in the tone of a woman closing a door. Mr. Dill, more shaken by the notion of a burned stable than a burned girl, said something about wages owed for the trouble, and Agnes said she would take none of it, she had only done what anyone would, and if anyone else had been standing nearer they'd have done the same. She did not know that Mr. Fell, watching from just inside the door, had heard every word of that refusal, and that it was the refusal itself, more than the burning straw, that fixed her in his mind like a name carved into a gatepost. He had known women who wept prettily over far smaller griefs and taken every coin offered them twice over. He had been engaged once to one such woman, and the memory of it sat in him like a stone he had learned to walk around rather than lift. He watched Agnes Thorne turn down payment for burns she had taken to save a boy who was nothing to her, and he thought, with the flat certainty of a man closing an account, that he had never in 35 years of being watched by everyone seen anyone behave so entirely, as though no one were watching at all. He went back to his room that night and did not sleep, which was not unusual for him, but for once the wakefulness had nothing to do with grief. By morning the yard had returned to its ordinary business, as yards do, the black patch of straw shovelled out and the loose nail hammered properly home at last, a full day later than it ought to have been. Agnes wrapped her hands in strips of clean linen and went on sweeping, because there was no one to sweep in her place, and because idleness was not a thing she allowed herself even in pain. Tam followed her about the yard all morning like a shadow that had decided to walk on its own, holding out things for her to take so she would not have to use her burned palms, an apple, a currycomb, a mug of small beer she had not asked for. Mr. Fell watched this too, from the inn's front step, over a letter he was pretending to write. He asked Mrs. Dill, idly, whether the girl had people. Mrs. Dill said no, not since her father died, and that she supposed Agnes would go on at the Kestrel until she was too old to sweep, and then go on some parish's charity, unless she married, and she wasn't the sort men married, being poor and plain and blunt as a hammer. Mrs. Fell said that seemed a poor use of a good hammer. Mrs. Dill laughed, not quite understanding him, and went back inside. That afternoon, before he left the Kestrel, Miss Fell had a quiet word with Mrs. Dill about the boy Tam, and about a bond of apprenticeship the boy owed the ostler's cousin in the next parish, a bond that kept him half a servant and half a debt no 11-year-old could ever hope to pay off honestly. He asked that the bond be settled, and settled quietly, and that no one be told who had done it. Mrs. Dill asked who should she say sent the money if pressed. Mr. Fell said she needn't say anyone sent it at all. He asked also that a proper surgeon be sent to look at the boy's hands and the girl's, whether she wanted it or not, and that the account for it go nowhere near either of them. He rode out the next morning on the tired bay gelding, and Agnes noted only that the quiet traveller had gone without ceremony, the way most travellers did, and thought no more of it, because she had no reason yet to think anything of Mr. Fell at all. She did not know that within the week a surgeon she had never sent for would arrive to dress her hands and the boy's, paid by a name he would not give. She did not know that Tam's bond would simply vanish from the ostler's ledger as though it had never been written, and that the ostler would be too baffled to ask questions of a debt so cleanly forgiven. She did not know that a man she believed she would never see again had ridden away from the Kestrel already turning over in his mind how he might see her once more, without being known for who he was, because he had decided, with the same flat certainty that had once told him whom not to marry, that he needed to know a great deal more about a woman who put out a fire with her own hands and asked for nothing after. The surgeon came 3 days later, sent, he said, by a gentleman who preferred not to be named, and dressed both sets of burns with a salve that smelled of comfrey and tallow. Agnes asked him twice who had sent him, and got the same answer twice, and gave it up, deciding privately that Mr. Dill had been more generous than he let on, and was too proud to say so. She thanked the surgeon plainly, and when he would take no payment either, only shrugged, and said he'd been paid already and handsomely. She frowned at that, but did not press further, because pressing a stranger for another stranger's business was not her habit. Tam's ostler, meanwhile, was heard grumbling in the tap-room that some fool had gone and settled the boy's bond without so much as a by your leave, and now he'd lost the cheapest labour in the county. And Mrs. Dill, who knew a good deal more than she let on, only told him that was a strange thing to complain of, having a debt forgiven, and went on drawing ale. Word travels slow, and then all at once, in a village the size of Brindlewood, and it was not many days before the whole yard knew that somebody had paid for Tam's freedom and the surgeon's fee both, and nobody knew who, and the not knowing became its own small entertainment among the grooms, each proposing a different benefactor, none of them guessing right. Agnes herself gave the matter less thought than anyone, because her hands still hurt when she gripped a broom too hard, and because a hired girl's days did not stop to admire mysteries. She noticed, though, without quite naming it a noticing, that the world had gone slightly kinder to her and to Tam both since that night, in ways too small and too scattered to add up to anything but coincidence. She did not think of the quiet traveller at all. She had already half forgotten his face. He had not forgotten hers. It was 3 weeks later, near the first thaw, that Mr. Fell came back to the Kestrel. this time with a horse that genuinely was unwell. A grey gelding gone off its feed and stiff in the near foreleg, a complaint he had manufactured with some care, having bought the horse expressly and unfashionably lame for the purpose. He asked for the girl who was good with horses, and Mrs. Dill sent for Agnes, who came out wiping her hands on her apron, expecting some ordinary lameness and finding, instead, a man she half remembered from a burning night she had mostly stopped thinking about. She looked at the horse first, because that was her habit and her honesty both. She ran her hand down its foreleg, watched its eye, asked when it had last been shod, and pronounced, after a silence long enough that Mr. Fell began to wonder if she suspected his fraud, that there was nothing much wrong with the animal beyond a stone bruise healing on its own, and that anyone who told him otherwise for a fee was cheating him. He said that was blunt of her. She said it would have been blunter still to let him waste money on a farrier for nothing, and if he wanted flattery he'd bought the wrong horse. He almost smiled at that. It was not a thing his face did easily or often, and the almost of it surprised him more than her words had. They fell into a habit over the following days, since his lame horse required, he claimed, a period of rest at the kestrel before it could travel on. He would come to the stable in the evenings, when the work was done and the yard was quiet, and stand at a respectful distance while she went about her chores, and ask her plain questions, and receive plain answers. He learned that her father had been a farrier, and had died of a chill caught, mending a bridge rail in the rain, because no one else would do it, and a child had nearly gone through the rotten boards the week before. He learned that she had no family living closer than a widowed aunt 3 villages off, that she read only a little, but read what she had carefully, that she had never once, in 3 years at the kestrel, taken a wage she thought she had not fully earned. She learned less of him, because he offered less, but she learned that he watched things closely before he judged them, that he did not laugh easily, but that when something struck him as genuinely absurd, a dry, short sound escaped him that he seemed almost embarrassed by afterward, and that he asked after Tam's hands and the state of the loft's new lantern bracket, with a persistence that seemed to her rather more thorough than a passing traveller's interest ought to run. Once, watching her wrap a cut on a colt's fetlock with quick, sure fingers, he said, half to himself, that he had known women who could not be trusted to bandage a finger without fainting at the sight of their own blood, let alone another creature's. She said that seemed a strange sort of woman to know. He said he had known one particularly strange sort, once, and did not go on, and she did not ask, because she had learned already that some doors he opened only a crack and shut again quickly, and that pushing at them earned nothing but silence. It was during this stretch of quiet evenings that the first of his secret kindnesses beyond the boy and the surgeon reached the inn, though neither Agnes nor anyone else connected it to the traveller with the lame grey horse. A sum arrived, unmarked and unclaimed, sufficient to mend the kestrel's roof before spring rains could finish the work the winter had started, delivered by a solicitor's clerk from the county town, who said only that he had been instructed to give no name and answer no questions about the source. Mrs. Dill wept a little over it, out of relief more than sentiment, and told Agnes she supposed some travelling gentleman had taken a fancy to the place and wanted it kept standing, and Agnes agreed that people were strange, and thought, not for the first time, that the kestrel seemed to have had a run of undeserved luck since the night of the fire, and did not think to ask why. He asked her, one such evening, what she would do if she were not bound to the inn, if she had money enough, and no need of a place. She said she supposed she would keep horses of her own, and teach some boy like Tam the trade properly, the way her father had meant to teach her brother before the brother died of the same winter that killed her mother. She said it plainly, without complaint, the way she said everything, and he watched her say it with an attention she had begun, without quite noticing, to find herself waiting for. She did not know that the man asking her these questions owned, among a great many other things, the very inn she stood in, 3 farms in the parish, and enough land beyond the ridge that a man could ride from dawn to dusk without crossing its boundary. She did not know that every answer she gave him was being turned over that night, alone, by firelight, weighed against the memory of a woman who had once wept beautifully over a broken glove, while a housemaid stood dismissed, and weeping harder in the doorway for a fault not her own. She did not know that the Duke of Rivenhall had begun, against every caution 35 years had taught him, to think of a hired girl's blunt honesty as the first true thing he had heard from anyone in longer than he cared to count. It could not last, of course, this quiet arrangement of lame horses and evening conversation, because nothing quiet ever does when a duke is involved, even a disguised one, and the world that knew him by his true name was not so very far away. Lady Cordelia Vane arrived at the Kestrel on a bright, hard morning in the first week of March, in a carriage with the Rivenhall crest half hidden under a travelling cloth, because she had come, she said to no one in particular, to see for herself what kept her cousin lingering at a common posting inn, when Rivenhall Hall stood empty and waiting not 4 miles distant. She was the sort of handsome that photographed well in a portrait and wore thin in a room, all fine bones and a laugh that came in 3 practised beats whenever she wished to suggest that something was beneath her notice. She had run Gareth's household since his mother's death, and she had done it competently and coldly, and she had long since decided that his eventual marriage was a matter for her to manage rather than his heart to choose, and that a well-connected heiress named Eleanor Price would suit both the family and Cordelia's own continued comfort a great deal better than anything he might stumble upon while playing at being a common man. She found him in the stable yard, in his shirt-sleeves, holding a grey gelding's lead while a stable girl in a mended apron checked its foreleg with bare, scarred hands, and something in the ease between them told her everything before a word was spoken. She laughed. 3 beats, bright and cold as the morning. "Well," she said, "so this is where you've been keeping yourself. I confess I expected something more interesting than a lame horse and a groom's daughter." Agnes straightened, wiping her hands on her apron, and said nothing, because she had not been addressed by name, and did not yet know she needed to defend herself. "Cordelia," the man said low, a warning in it that Agnes heard but did not understand, because she had known him only as Mr. Fell, and a lady did not call an ordinary traveller by his given name with such easy familiarity unless she knew him rather better than a traveller's acquaintance allowed. Cordelia's eyes went over Agnes the way a buyer's eyes go over a horse not worth the asking price, resting a moment too long on her red scarred palms. "Burned your hands in someone's service, I see," she said. "How industrious of you. I do hope you were paid." "I wasn't looking to be," Agnes said. "No," Cordelia said, and smiled the way a closing door smiles. "I imagine girls like you rarely are. It is such a convenient sort of virtue, isn't it? The kind that costs you nothing to claim and everyone else nothing to admire. Tell me, does he know you scrub floors as well as you doctor his horse, or has he not asked what else your hands are good for?" Agnes felt the words land the way a slap lands, meant to leave a mark where it could not be seen, and she did not answer it with anger, because anger was a coin she had decided long ago never to spend on people who wanted it from her. "I do what's needed," she said. "That's all. I don't ask what it's worth to anyone watching." "How fortunate for you that someone is always watching, then," Cordelia said, "since it seems to have bought you a great deal of a strange gentleman's time." The man beside Agnes went very still, the way she had learned to read as anger held on a short lead, and he said, quietly, that Cordelia had said quite enough, and that if she had business with him she might state it inside, and not in a stable yard in front of people who had done nothing to deserve her tongue. Cordelia's eyes flicked to him with something sharper than surprise, as though he had broken a rule she had not thought he knew existed, defending a stable girl in front of witnesses, and she laughed once more, thinner this time, and said she would wait for him inside, since it seemed the yard held more of his attention than his own family did these days. She left in a swirl of good wool and cold scent, and Agnes stood very still afterward, her burned hands loose at her sides, and did not cry, because she had trained herself long ago not to cry where it showed, and there were still 2 grooms within sight of the yard. "You needn't mind her," the man said. "Lo, I don't," Agnes said. "Fine words don't cost me anything either." She paused. "She called you something. Before, a name. A slip," he said. "She talks a great deal, and means less than half of it." Agnes looked at him a long moment, and did not press, because she had already learned which doors he shut quickly, but something in her had gone quiet and watchful in a new way, and she found she no longer entirely believed he was only Mr. Fell of no particular county, though she could not yet have said why, or what she thought he was instead. She went back to her work because the horse still wanted looking at, and the day did not stop for anyone's discomfort, hers least of all. But she carried Cordelia's words with her the rest of that day and the next, the way one carries a stone in a shoe, small and constant and impossible to entirely ignore, and she began, without quite deciding to watch the stranger's face for whatever it was he was not telling her. He did not come to the stable that evening. She told herself she had not expected him to. The trouble, when it came, did not arrive as a single blow, but as a slow tightening, the way frost takes a pond, from the edges in. Mrs. Dill, 2 days after Lady Cordelia's visit, took Agnes aside with a face full of apology, and said that the Vane family, who held the lease on half the kestrel's land, and had never troubled to remind anyone of it before, had sent word that a certain stable hand's conduct with a gentleman guest had been remarked upon, and remarked upon unfavourably, and that it would go easier for everyone if the girl in question found other work before the matter grew into more talk than the inn could afford. Agnes heard this out in silence, standing very straight, her hands folded in front of her so their scarring would not show. "I've done nothing," she said, "that I'm ashamed to have watched." "I know it, Mrs. Dill said, miserable. "I know it, Agnes. But knowing it and keeping the lease are 2 different roads, and I've Dill and the children to think of." Agnes said she understood, and she did, because she had watched enough of the world to know that the poor were forever being made to pay for the comfort of people who had never once had to choose between their principles and their roof. She asked only 2 days to arrange herself elsewhere, and Mrs. Dill, weeping now in earnest, gave her the week. She did not go to the man she still knew as Mr. Fell and ask him to intervene, though the thought crossed her once, and she put it down as quickly as it had risen, because asking a near stranger to fight her battles was not a thing she had ever done, and was not a thing she meant to start now, and because some stubborn, wounded part of her had decided that whatever he was, whatever name Lady Cordelia had nearly let slip. It was clearly a world with room in it for cruelty like Cordelia's, and none, apparently, for a stable girl's dignity, and she would not go begging entrance to it. She wrote him a short note instead, left with Mrs. Dill to give him whenever he next came asking after his horse, saying only that she had taken a place with her aunt in the next parish, and thanking him for his custom. Plain words for a plain matter, nothing in them that a stranger's note should not hold. She packed what little she owned into a single bag the next morning, said her goodbyes to the horses first, because they at least would not pretend sorrow they did not feel, and to Tam last, because the boy cried outright and did not care who saw him, and told her he would run off after her the moment he was old enough, and she told him he would do no such foolish thing. He would stay and learn his letters and grow into a man worth the trouble everyone had gone to for him, and he asked, tearfully, who that everyone was, since no one would ever say, and she said she did not know, and that some kindnesses simply were not owed an answer. She walked the 4 miles to her aunt's cottage, with her bag over her shoulder and her ruined cloak, mended now, wrapped against the wind, and she did not look back at the kestrel's chimney smoke, because looking back was a thing she had also trained herself out of, on the theory that a person who looked back too often never got anywhere at all. She did not know, walking that road, that the man she had left a plain note for had returned to the kestrel within the hour of her leaving, and had read her few words twice, and had gone very white about the mouth in a way Mrs. Dill had never seen on the quiet Mr. Fell before, and had asked, in a voice gone suddenly hard and entirely unlike a traveller's, exactly what had prompted a girl with no other prospects to leave a place she'd held 3 years, in the space of 2 days, without a single complaint spoken aloud. Mrs. Dill, weeping again for what felt like the 3rd time that week, told him everything. The Vane family's letter, the lease, her own shame at having asked it of a girl who deserved better than any of them had given her. She did not know that the man went out to the yard afterward and stood a long while at the stable door, where he had first watched a fire put out by 2 burned hands, and that when he came back inside his face had the look of a man who had just finished making a decision he did not intend to unmake for anyone, cousin or crown. Agnes's aunt, Prudence Thorne, was a widow of few words and a great deal of quiet competence, and she took her niece in without questions, gave her the small room off the kitchen, and set her to mending for the 2 of them together, and life, for a fortnight, narrowed itself down to needle and thread, and the particular grey quiet of a woman, trying very hard not to think about a man whose true name she had never learned, and now never would. It was Prudence, in fact, who first brought the strange talk home from the village well, where such talk always gathered fastest. There was a story going about, she said, stirring the pot with more attention than the story strictly required, about the Duke of Rivenhall himself, of all people, having spent the better part of the winter travelling his own estate in disguise, under some false name, to see how his tenants and innkeepers truly fared when they thought no duke was watching. Some said he'd found a steward cheating 3 farms blind and turned him off without a character. Some said he'd paid a boy's apprenticeship debt at the kestrel out of his own pocket and sworn Mrs. Dill to silence about it. Some said there was a girl in it somewhere, though nobody in the village seemed to agree on who or what she'd done, only that the Duke had been seen defending some stable hand against his own cousin's tongue, which Lady Cordelia was said to be furious about in a way that had reached even the vicarage. Agnes sat very still over her mending, and said nothing while her aunt talked, because the pieces of it were arranging themselves in her mind with a speed that frightened her. The traveller who paid too much attention to a colicking horse that was never truly lame, the surgeon who would not name his sender, the roof mended by a gift no one claimed, Cordelia's slip of a name in the yard, and she felt something in her chest go very cold and very hollow all at once. The particular hollow of having been, without her knowledge, an object of a great man's private study. She did not weep. She set her needle down very carefully, and did not pick it up again for the rest of that hour, and her aunt, watching her, said nothing more about the Wells gossip, sensing that her niece had gone somewhere private and would come back from it in her own time. It was 2 days later that Mrs. Fenwick came. Mrs. Fenwick was housekeeper at Rivenhall Hall, and had been for 11 years a broad, dry, unhurried woman who had buried a husband and raised 3 sons, and had long ago decided that very little in this life was worth being flustered over, a decision that made her uniquely suited to serving a household run, in practice, by a grieving young duke and his sharp-tongued cousin. She arrived at Prudence Thorne's cottage in a hired gig, unannounced, and asked plainly to speak with Miss Agnes Thorne, and Agnes came out to her with her sleeves still rolled from washing and her hair coming loose, and Mrs. Fenwick looked her over the way a woman looks over a horse she has already decided to buy, with satisfaction rather than judgment. "You'll be wondering, Mrs., Fenwick said, without preamble, why a duke's housekeeper has come 4 miles in the cold to find a stable girl in her washing apron. I've had a good deal of wondering to do this week already, Agnes said. I don't imagine one more thing will tip the scale." Mrs. Fenwick almost smiled at that, the corners of her mouth doing something brief and approving. "He didn't send me," she said. "He'd be furious if he knew I'd come, being a man who likes to manage his own confessions. But I've served that house 11 years, Miss Thorne, and I watched that boy bury his mother and get engaged to a woman who made a housemaid weep for a broken glove that wasn't the girl's fault at all, and I watched him become the kind of man who trusts almost nobody. And in 11 years I have never once seen him do the things he's done since a certain night at the Kestrel." She told Agnes then, plainly, sitting at Prudence's kitchen table with her hands folded, about the Duke of Rivenhall's habit of travelling incognito once or twice a year, since his father's time, to see for himself what his stewards and innkeepers and tenants did when they believed no duke was watching, a habit born of his father's own hard lesson that flattered men lie and unwatched men show their true faces. She told her about a paid rent here, a sent doctor there, a schooled child in the next village whose fees came from nowhere anyone could name. Always the same instruction attached, that no name be given, because he had said to her once, only once, that being thanked for it felt too much like being paid for something that ought never to be sold. He asked not to be named, Mrs., Fenwick said, every single time. "I don't say this to make him a saint, Miss Thorne. I say it because I think you ought to know what sort of man watched you put out that fire before you decide what to make of the fact that he watched at all." Agnes sat with her hands in her lap, very still, and asked at last the only question that mattered to her. "Why did he let me believe he was nobody at all?" "That, Mrs., Fenwick said, rising and gathering her cloak, "is a question he means to answer himself, if you'll give him the chance. He asked me to bring you this, and to say nothing further about it, and I've already said a good deal more than that, so you'll forgive an old woman her failures of discretion." She handed Agnes a folded letter, sealed plainly, and left before Agnes could decide whether to be angry or grateful or simply overwhelmed by the sheer size of what had just been set down in front of her. The letter asked, in a hand she did not recognise but somehow already knew, that she come to Rivenhall Hall at whatever hour suited her, and that a carriage would wait at the crossroads each morning for a week in case she changed her mind, and that if she never came at all, the debt of Tam's bond and the surgeon's fee, and every other quiet thing done for her, would remain paid in full and unspoken of, and owed to nothing, because it had never been kindness done on credit. She went on the third morning, because curiosity and something harder to name finally outweighed her pride, and because Prudence, reading the letter over her shoulder without apology, told her plainly that a woman who refused to hear a man's explanation out of stubbornness alone was cutting off her nose to spite a face that had, by every account, done nothing but good since the moment it first saw her. Rivenhall Hall was larger than anything Agnes had stood inside in her life. Stone and ivy, and high cold halls that smelled of beeswax and old fires, and the servants who received her at the door were correctly, carefully polite, in the manner of people who had been told to expect a guest they privately found very strange indeed. And Lady Cordelia, passing through the entrance hall on some errand of her own, stopped dead at the sight of her, and said nothing at all, which from Cordelia was its own kind of thunder. Agnes was shown, after a wait long enough to make her hands go cold with more than the weather, into a small private study, where a fire was already lit, and the door closed firmly behind her, leaving her alone with the man she had known as Mr. Fell, who stood when she entered and did not sit again until she had. He looked, she thought, like a man about to confess to something far worse than he actually meant to say, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the fire popping once in the grate, a clock somewhere ticking through the silence like a held breath. "My name," he said, at last, "is Gareth Rivenhall. I am the Duke of that name, though I gave you none of it at the kestrel, and that omission was a deception, whatever kinder word I might dress it in, and I do not intend to dress it in one." Agnes said nothing, and let him go on, because she had come this far to hear the whole of it, and would not make it easier for him by filling his silences. "My father taught me," he said, "that a man in my position is lied to constantly and flattered worse, and that the only true thing you ever learn about a person is what they do when they believe themselves unwatched by anyone whose opinion could cost or profit them. I have travelled under false names since I was younger than you, testing stewards, testing innkeepers, testing my own household when I dared. I came to the kestrel because a letter told me the roof leaked and the accounts didn't balance, and I stayed at the stable door that night because I heard a lantern fall before anyone else did, and I watched you put out a fire with your own 2 hands and ask for nothing after, and I have not, in 35 years, seen anything that told me more about a person's true character in so short a space of time. You might have said so," Agnes said, "instead of pretending to own a lame horse for a fortnight." "I might have," he agreed. "I told myself I was protecting the test. In truth, I think I was protecting myself. I was engaged once to a woman who wept beautifully over a broken glove, while a maid stood dismissed for it, a maid who had done nothing wrong at all, and I did not see the truth of her until it was very nearly too late to undo, and I have not fully trusted my own judgment of anyone since, least of all judgment formed too quickly. And I did not want to be wrong about you the way I had been wrong about her. So I watched, and asked, and told myself I would explain everything once I was certain, and I was certain a great deal sooner than I let myself admit, and I let the deception run longer than honesty allowed, because I was afraid of what would happen the moment you knew who I was. What did you think would happen? That you would stop being yourself in front of me," he said, "simply that you would curtsy, and measure your words, and become like every other woman who has ever stood in this room aware of exactly what standing in it might buy her. I did not want that. I wanted the woman who put out a fire and asked for nothing, I am sorry it cost you your place, and your peace to give her to me a while longer than was fair." Agnes sat with that a long moment, turning it over the way she turned over an unfamiliar tool before deciding whether it was made for the work at hand. "You might simply have told me," she said again, quieter now, and trusted that I'd be myself regardless. "I know it," he said. "I have had a great deal of time this fortnight to know it. I am telling you now, in full, and I will not ask you to forgive the not telling before you're ready to. I only ask that you know the whole of it, so that whatever you decide to do with me from here, you decide it with every fact I have." Something in that landing, the refusal to hurry her toward absolution, undid a knot in Agnes that Cordelia's cruelty and Mrs. Dill's dismissal and the whole strange fortnight had drawn tight without her quite noticing. "I'm not angry that you're a duke," she said. "I'm not certain I'm even angry that you didn't say so. I think I'm angry that I spent a fortnight wondering what I'd done wrong, when the whole time it was never about me at all. It was about a test I didn't know I was taking. It stopped being a test," he said, "before the first week was out. I kept coming back after that because I wanted to, not because I still needed proving anything." She looked at him a long while, and the fire popped again, and somewhere beyond the study door she thought she heard the brisk, unhurried tread of Mrs. Fenwick pretending not to be listening, and she found, to her own surprise, that she believed him, not because dukes were owed belief, but because nothing in his account asked anything of her in return. "What do you want from me now?" she said, "now that I know." "Nothing you are not entirely free to refuse," he said. "I will not ask you to answer tonight. I have made that mistake before, asking too fast, in the wrong spirit of the wrong woman, and I will not repeat it with the right one. Take whatever time you need. Your no will be as safe with me as your yes." She looked down at her own hands, scarred faintly across the palms where a fire had once burned through wool and skin both, and thought of Tam's bond forgiven, the roof mended, the surgeon paid, all of it done and asked no name for, all of it done, she understood now, by the same quiet accounting that had watched her that night and decided she was worth watching over ever since. "I should like to know one thing first," she said, "before I decide anything at all." "Ask it." "Was it only the fire?" she said. "Or was there something before it, something in me you'd already decided to look for?" He was quiet a moment, weighing the honesty of the answer before he gave it. "I had decided," he said, "long before that night, that I would trust nothing flattering and nothing performed. I did not know I was looking for you specifically until I found you, but I think, in some fashion, I had been looking a long while. It was answer enough. She did not say yes that night, because he had asked her not to hurry, and because some part of her still wanted to test the ground before she set her whole weight on it, but she stayed to supper, at Mrs. Fenwick's insistence and his own quiet, unpressing invitation, and for the first time since the kestrel's yard, she let herself laugh outright at something he said, a dry, understated remark about Cordelia's fondness for arriving unannounced precisely when her arrival could do the most damage, and the sound of her own laughter surprised her nearly as much as the sight of his answering smile surprised him, because it was not a thing his face did easily, and it did it now without his seeming to notice he'd allowed it. She went home to her aunt's cottage that night, in the same hired gig that had first brought Mrs. Fenwick to her door, and she did not decide anything final on the ride, but something in her chest had gone warm instead of hollow, and she understood, dimly, that this was itself an answer forming, even before she was ready to speak it aloud. Spring came properly to Brindlewood in the way it always does, slow and then all at once, the hedgerows greening before anyone quite noticed, the roads drying enough for easy travel, and in that stretch of lengthening days Gareth came to Prudence Thorne's cottage more than once. Always by daylight, always announced, never again under a false name, and each visit he asked Agnes some small honest question, and answered whatever she asked him in return. And slowly, the way frost gives way to thaw rather than all at once, the wariness between them wore down into something neither of them troubled to name yet, because naming it too soon felt like the old fault repeating itself. It was on one such visit, in April, with the windows of Prudence's small parlour open to let in air that smelled of new grass and turned earth, that he asked her, at last, plainly, whether she would consider becoming his wife. And he asked it sitting, not standing over her. And he asked it without a ring produced with theatre, only his bare hand held open on the table between them. An offering rather than a demand. "I want to say first," he said, "that I know what people will say, that you are a stable hand and I am a duke, and that this will look, to Cordelia and to half the county, like charity dressed up as love. I do not care what it looks like. I care what it is. I have watched you 3 months now in every kind of weather, kind and unkind both. And you have not once been anything but exactly yourself, and I find I want nothing else beside me for the rest of my life." Agnes did not answer at once. She drew off her right glove, finger by finger, slowly the wool worn thin at the seams from years of mending, and set it on the table beside his open hand, and only then did she lay her bare palm against his, scarred skin against scarred skin, because his hands, she had noticed months before and never remarked on, carried their own old marks from some accident of his youth he had never explained, and she had never asked him to. "I'll have terms," she said, "if I'm to say yes. Name them." "I'm to be spoken to plainly," she said. "Always, whatever the news, good or bad. I've had enough of people deciding what I'm fit to be told, and I'm never to be lied to again, not even kindly, not even to spare me a hard week, and I'll keep every part of myself that I am now. I won't be made over into a duchess who's forgotten how to doctor a horse or mend a harness, because that woman is the one you say you want, and I'll not trade her away for a title." "Agreed," he said, to every term, and gladly. Then yes, she said. It was the only word she needed. He raised her bare hand to his mouth, and kissed her knuckles, once gently over the old scarring there, and it was as far as either of them went that afternoon. Because the ceiling of what was proper between them had not moved, only the warmth beneath it, and that, for now, was enough for both. The wedding, when it came in early June, was small as dukes' weddings went, which was to say still grander than anything Brindlewood had seen in a generation, held in the parish church, with Prudence Thorne weeping openly in the front pew, and Tam, scrubbed pink and solemn in a new coat Mrs. Fenwick had made for the occasion, standing at the door handing out orders of service as though he had been born to it. Lady Cordelia attended, because propriety demanded it, and sat through the whole of it with a face like carved stone, and left before the wedding breakfast was properly under way, on the excuse of a headache no one troubled to believe. Within the month, on Gareth's quiet insistence, and without any public unpleasantness attached to it, Cordelia removed to a cousin's house in Bath, where she was said to manage a smaller household with the same cold competence and considerably less influence, and where, in time, the county's memory of her grew shorter and kinder than her conduct had ever earned. Because that too was a kind of justice, the plain kind, without cruelty in its dispensing. A year turned. In the following June, On an evening much like the one that had first brought a lantern down into dry straw, Agnes stood in the doorway of the Rivenhall stables, now hers in every practical sense, though she never called them so. Watching a groom she had trained herself walk a young mare in slow circles in the yard. The lantern above the tack-room, hanging steady on a bracket that had been reset. Twice over by a carpenter under instruction, never to let it come loose again, as long as the house stood. Tam was 12 now, and lodged at the Hall, and read passably well, and swept the stable-yard still, because he liked the work, and no one had the heart to make him stop, simply because his bond had long since been forgiven. And he came running across the yard that evening to tell her the mare had settled at last, pleased with himself in the particular way of boys who have been trusted with something and not failed at it. Gareth found her there, as the light went long and gold across the cobbles, and stood beside her without a word for a while, the way he had learned to, because she had taught him that silence shared was its own kind of speech. "You're thinking of that night," he said, at last. "I'm thinking," she said, "that the lantern never fell again. That's all. It's a small thing to be glad of." "It's not small," he said. "It's the whole of it, I think. Everything came from a lantern falling, and a woman deciding, before she had any reason to think it mattered, that she'd rather burn her own hands than let a boy burn." She looked at him and did not answer that directly, only reached for his hand, and he took hers. Bare fingers laced through bare fingers, both of them scarred in their own old ways, and they stood together at the stable door a long while, watching the last light go out of the yard, and neither one let go. It was, in the end, a small thing that had begun it all, a loose nail and a swinging light, and it proved, as small things often do, to be the truest measure of everything that came after. A person's worth is rarely written where it can be read by everyone. It is written, instead, in the moment they believe no one of consequence is watching at all. If a story about a woman who asked for nothing and was seen anyway warmed something in you tonight, subscribe to the channel so the next one finds you when it's ready. I'd love to know in the comments what you think truly won Agnes her Duke, the fire she put out, or the payment she refused after. Tell me which one you'd have done, in her place, with no one watching at all. Until the next story, stay warm, stay kind even when it costs you, and I'll see you soon with another tale worth staying up for.